Awesome. Welcome back to part 2 of Zero to SLO Hero. In this video, we're going to talk about some examples with some Prometheus queries and talk about the pros and cons, including the challenges that you might face trying to set something up like this in your own company. So going back to a couple of things we talked about in the first video, we're going to start with the customer journey. If you remember this, when we start thinking about SLOs, we really want to start with the customer. What are they doing with our product? What features do they rely on the most? And what does their journey look like on our site? We talked about getting in touch with your product managers or directly with your customers to try to find out these sorts of things so that you can, in turn, connect the types of services that you're maintaining and creating towards what your customers are doing and at what they actually care about. You'll also remember we went through the 4 golden signals: latency, traffic, errors, and saturation, as well as some other common SLIs that you might think about using and connecting of what your service is doing towards what your customers are doing: availability, throughput, queue depth, and correctness. So if we go back to our Google Workspace example, and I like using this one because it feels very tangible, let's think about this in terms of an actual query. So if you look at their SLA site, Google defines downtime as for a domain if there is more than a 5% user error rate. And downtime is measured based off of the server side error rate. So that means if at any point in time there's at least 5% error, it's considered down. And it needs to be down for, we saw that it needed to be down for 99.9%. So it needs to be at any given moment have at least a 5% error rate for 44 minutes in order for us to exceed our SLA. So looking back at our proposed SLO chart here for our Google Workspace SLAs, we can see our suggested targets are 99.95% for an acceptable experience, 99.5% for a poor experience, and 97% for a bad experience. And those are all just buffers to our SLAs to help us alert early before we hit those really bad consequences. So let's take this and translate it into an SLI that we can use and then actually see an SLO chart from it. All right, so with this SLI, we're going to be measuring the rate of errors. So for example, if we take gmail.com, which is within the Google Workspace, and we take this Prometheus query, we can measure the rate of HTTP requests that match a 500 status code, which would be like an internal server error. And we're going to divide that by the total number of requests. And this is over a 60-second period, 1 minute. So for example, if we had 10 errors that matched the 500 status code and we had 1,000 requests total, we know that that would give us a ratio of 1%. So 1% doesn't meet what Google defined as downtime. However, if we had 50 errors that matched the 500 status code and still only 1,000 total requests, that would actually be 5%, and that would meet downtime, and that would actually count toward our error budget. So that means if we had 22 minutes available to us in our error budget, and in this particular minute, we qualified for being down, that 1 minute would get subtracted from our error budget, and we'd have only 21 minutes left. So now that we have our SLI query, we're going to go ahead and put that into an SLO platform. I'm just going to continue using examples from Noble 9. So in this chart here, this is a 4-hour time window where it's charting that the returns from that SLI query on a per minute basis. This is downsampled a little bit because, of course, this is 4 hours smushed into a pretty short image, but you could see here that I actually have it set to alert on anything that goes above 3%. So we know we can't exceed more than a 5% error rate. So I want to actually alert significantly before that. And instead, I'm going to alert and eat my error budget anytime that during that minute, my query is at over a 3% error rate. So with that SLI chart now, that's all going to get factored into my actual SLO graph. And what the SLO graph is really just a burn down of how it's eating up my error budget. And so in this example, I'm showing the acceptable and poor experience targets that I had written out in our Google Workspace chart. And in my acceptable target, I'm actually running out of error budget. You can see I only have 5 minutes left. But my burn rate is currently at 0 times, which means I'm not currently receiving any errors that count against my allotted error budget or downtime. So I'm starting to recover. So as my time window continues to move forward, I will slowly start to recover some of the time that I lost when I was actively eating my error budget at the beginning of that time window. So, and you can also see here in my poor SLO, I'm actually still holding on pretty strong. You can see there was some error budget burned, but I had significantly more error budget available to me. So in this one, I had 3.5 hours remaining at the end of this burn section. So I didn't end up eating through nearly as much of my error budget. In some cases, you might only set alerts on one of these SLOs and not the other. So for example, maybe your acceptable SLO is actually buffered really well. And even if you ate that entire budget up, you know that your customers still won't be affected yet. And so you don't have to necessarily alert on that because it's not urgent, but it's still something that you want to track. And so you can save your alerting for the poor SLO, and that will give you significantly more time to determine what's actually urgent or not, and maybe save your weekend. So that was an example of an SLI that uses error rate to measure our SLO. Let's take a look at another example here that's going to use latency instead. So in this example, it says, my customers rely on my service to provide real-time stock quotes. If my service is delayed, my customers are getting out-of-date information that is crucial to the actions that they take in my app. And so this here gives you a very clear example of a customer journey, right? So they check the stocks, they expect real-time values, and then they take action, other separate actions in your app from it. So latency is going to be a really important one for this because they're expecting real-time values. So let's take a look at the SLI that we would use for this. So instead of a ratio on this one, we could use something like a threshold. So in this one, we're going to take HTTP request durations in seconds for whatever job is running my service. And this is going to, again, be over a 1 minute time period. So again, latency is the time it takes for a system to respond to a request. And so in this case, the request would be a customer loads a page that connects to the service that looks for real-time stock data. So we can take this SLI and we put it into an SLO where we can set our target to something like 99.99% of all requests need to be within 500 milliseconds. So what that's saying is when we make a request to view real-time stock details, we want it to return the values within 500 milliseconds of making that request. And of course, there's going to be other parts to this. For example, you need to know whatever system updates your database, for example, that stores all of that real-time stock data needs to make sure that that information is up to date too. So you might have a separate SLO for that, or you can add that to this SLI directly as well. SLIs can get pretty hairy the more you add to it. So I personally like to keep them simplified because I think it makes it a little bit more clear about what you're measuring when you can very easily read through the SLI query itself and understand what you're measuring versus having to interpret all these crazy calculations from your SLI just to figure out what you're trying to measure. So let's take a look at another example using a saturation SLI. So in this example, every time my service is greater than or equal to 85% CPU consumption, it crashes and my users are unable to access the login page until my service can recover. Now, this one isn't necessarily from the customer's perspective, but we do exactly correlate how it affects our customers, which is the important piece here. So in this Prometheus query, we're taking the rate of the container CPU seconds total per minute, and we are multiplying it by 100 to get the CPU utilization in a percentage. So for an SLO like this, I might actually want two separate targets again. So for an acceptable experience, I might want something like 99% of all values in this query to return under 80% of CPU utilization. And what that'll tell me is as long as I'm under 80%, my service should not be crashing, and my customers will continue to be able to use my login service without any interruptions. And that'll be my acceptable experience. Now, what I might do as like a warning or like alarming experience or poor experience, whatever you want to call it, I might do something like 99.5% of all requests should be under 82%. And that's one that I might actually alert on. So I mean 82% CPU utilization, just to be clear. So hopefully those SLI examples were helpful for you to visualize how you can actually use them in SLOs and the types of things that you could measure and how they connect back to your customer. Now I want to go over some of the pros and cons of using SLOs. Now, to me, it has some very clear pros, right? We have clear performance targets that make it easy to understand how our services are doing that we build. I think it increases communication and continuous improvement because we definitely have better data to inform important decisions. We have more data to say whether or not we have the cycles to actually be building new features, or if we need to fix what we've already built in the past. So it's really a conversation about reliability, being able to talk to your product teams and other aspects of the business to make sure that they understand that as much as we want to be able to deliver new things to customers, we also need to be able to deliver on the things that we already have promised them. And those are going to be features that already exist, right? So it improves communication interdepartmentally too. Two of the things that I think are big cons, this is not a silver bullet, right? There's a lot of work involved in building SLOs and building this culture. It's a culture shift. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. There's a lot of teams that you have to talk to, customers that you have to talk to. As much as it increases your interdepartmental communication, part of that is because you need everybody involved in order to set these standards for yourself. So standardizing SLOs, especially on large teams, can be tough. There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, a lot of people who have a lot of opinions about things, and not everybody's always going to be in agreement, but this is a method that you can use to at least start those conversations and see if you can get everybody to some sort of compromise. I think it's also something that a lot of people fall into traps to, where there's not a lot of process around building their SLOs. And so people will end up setting unrealistic standards because they don't know where to start. And then very quickly give up on SLOs because they feel like it's not helping them yet. So I think my advice there for you is to start small. I know it can be overwhelming at first to be setting these crazy goals for yourself. I think the more you learn to trust your system and the longer that you've had it in play where you can tweak it and make sure that it's always correlating to some real value for you, the process will fall into place and it will feel significantly better. But that's hard to do when you start too big. So I want to talk about a couple of specific challenges in doing this in teams. So the first one that I always hear about, and I've experienced myself as well, is buy-in. If your company isn't already using SLOs, getting the business to buy into it can be a really hard sell. It often sounds like it's going to slow things down, and at the very beginning it does. But I think with a lot of companies, that's actually something that's a really good thing to do. I think we end up speeding up our process a lot to try to make customers happy, because on the business side of things, happy customers sound like new features. And that's not always the case. If we can't deliver on the things that we've already promised them, the features that we've already built, things are going to slow down anyway. Your customers aren't going to be happy. They're going to be complaining, and building new features isn't going to cover that up with a Band-Aid. So getting buy-in is going to be tough. I think where this comes to play is talking about the perceived value. Making sure everybody is aligned and on the same page is already going to make your customers significantly happier, because they're going to get the information that they need faster and more reliably as well. There's a really good book that talks honestly like a lot about this process of getting the buy-in and getting everybody on the same page. And it's The Phoenix Project. If you haven't already read that, I really recommend it. Very popular book in our industry, but I think it has a lot of really important lessons for getting buy-in and getting everybody to work together, and how much more efficiently everything runs when everybody is working as a single unit instead of in their little individual spaces. And that's part of the goal of SLOs. One of the next big challenges that I always see is ownership. SLOs are not a set it and forget it thing. These are meant to be iterated. If clear ownership and regular check-ins are not defined, they can easily be forgotten or ignored. So I like to keep ownership with the teams that own the services. And so that means if the front-end web team wants to build an SLO for the latency on loading the web page, that's something that should stay in their realm. It should be owned by that web team. And I also recommend at least quarterly to review your SLOs. Again, it takes a while to tweak them once you first set them up, and so don't be afraid to change them. SLOs are internal only for us. They're not SLAs. We don't have to worry about customers coming to us to complain that we're not meeting our SLO. We reserve that for SLAs, right? And we talked about that a little bit in the first video. But the best thing that you can do is start anywhere. Get at least one SLO down. Set some targets for yourself. Even if you set multiple because you're not sure where to start, see how they react. The only way that you're going to be able to tweak these and make them better is if you start and you get some sort of data to be able to tell you more information about how you need to do these. I don't think it's ever going to be a rush thing. And if somebody is trying to rush you, I encourage you to ask them to slow down, because I think if they're rushing through at building SLOs, they're not having the right types of conversations that are going to make SLOs effective. And the last and one of the biggest challenges, I think, is where to start. You know, there's not always going to be a perfect template for the service that you've built. And that's why it's important to start the conversations with other parts of the business. You know, start by talking to your product managers. If you don't have those, talk to your customers directly. Find out how they're using the product, and then get creative on finding ways through your currently existing monitoring or tools that you could add to your stack that can link those behaviors back to specific behaviors in your service. And keep in mind the four golden signals and all the other SLI types that we've talked about, because that'll help give you some idea of, you know, ways that you can correlate things that the customer is doing. So hopefully that was helpful. I hope everybody learned something new today. Thank you, and hope everybody enjoys SLOConf 2023.